Hi there. I'm Martha Boff, a registered dietitian and the social media manager for Helm Publishing. We provide nutrition continuing education, self-study courses to dietitians and healthcare professionals. In addition to running their social media, I work in the oyster industry where I source unique oysters and bring them to Colorado. March is National Nutrition Month, and the theme is Beyond the Table, which addresses the farm to fork aspect of nutrition from food production and distribution to navigating grocery stores and farmers markets. It also describes the various ways we eat and includes sustainability. So today we're very lucky to have Kyle Frey, who's an oyster farmer and owner of Crystal Coast Oysters out of Moorhead, North Carolina. And we're going to discuss all things oyster farming and how that ties in with sustainability. So thank you so much for being here, Kyle.
Absolutely. Yeah. Love to. Yeah. Oyster farming and sustainability, they pretty much go hand in hand. And I'm really happy that you're doing this. So happy to be here and happy to answer any questions you got.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question I'm going to ask, because I feel like a lot of people, are curious or don't really know, but, what is oyster farming? And just kind of like describing the process of cultivating the oysters, starting from, obtaining seed.
Absolutely. So oyster farming is very similar to terrestrial farming. Our seed is actually grown in hatcheries. It'll start in the hatchery, and that is where they'll take oysters and they'll spawn them onto crushed up oyster shell. And these oysters spawn in a certain temperature and they will swim around for about 15 days. The hatchery will crush up oyster shell into very, 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 very fine sand. And they'll put the spawned oysters into a box, and the babies will find one little piece of sand to attach to. And that is how the single oyster is created. Typically in the wild, you'll find them in clusters because they'll attach to things. But at the hatcheries, they've made such small pieces of sand that only one oyster can fit per piece of sand. The hatchery's job is basically to get them up to about a millimeter. And then it's given to what we call a nursery, which is also very similar to farming. I guess ranching actually with pigs. They call them like feeder pigs. So it's like you have the nursery, which gets them next from the hatchery, and that will grow them from 1 millimeter. We typically buy our seed at 6 millimeter, which you find a very easy size to work with. And then the farmer grows it out to market size. This whole process, it basically allows for the oysters to grow more uniform and have access to more food. It's starting to get more popular as a sustainable protein, but it is one of the best sustainable proteins out there, hands down.
I agree. Yeah.
It's like the only protein that you can scale, and it's better for the environment. Also, for the consumer. I mean, you know more than I do about the benefits of the health of the oyster. Our long-term goal, is to get oysters comparable to the price of chicken, if not lower. And that's like a 30-year goal. That I think that would have the most benefit form of sustainability, because oysters filter water, provide ecosystem. They do so much. And the more we grow, the better it is for the coast, and the better it is for the consumers. Price wise and from a health perspective. So, we got reefs, shoreline protection, permeable concrete. They're starting to use them in permeable concrete. Calcium, the calcium, they can be used in calcium pills for chickens to make their shells harder. It's almost debatable, like whether the meat is more valuable or the shell is more valuable at this point.
I think it's very interesting that oysters, it takes almost like no input, so they don't require like
no
feed.
Vets.
No vets. Like all of these things that are required in farming livestock. You have oysters, which are pretty, self-sufficient. Like as farmers, you're taking care of them and making sure that they're growing, and you're touching the bags and all of that. But it's much less like from an environmental standpoint to take care of and like grow oysters than if you were to livestock.
Absolutely. That 100% agree. And it also allows for scaling. I heard that the way it transfers most energy to the planet is through algae and phytoplankton. And that's where that's where the oysters get their food source from.
So I guess like my next question would be, so you're an oyster farmer, an oyster farmer that's committed to sustainability. What measures do you take to minimize environmental impacts and really just ensure the long-term viability of your oyster beds?
Our livelihood is tied to that river. We feel like our role is protecting the Newport River, which has got us in town council meetings. It's got us looking at what kind of concrete's getting put in. And it's not just me. Every farm that's basically put in a river becomes an ambassador and really a protector of that river, a
Mhm.
voice for the river who has no voice. We're trying to actively change the environments around these water bodies to prevent runoff. Permeable concrete is such an easy solution to that. It just takes education. We're trying to actually purchase land around to conserve. We don't
Yeah.
want any more development. Or if it is, we want it developed in a sustainable way, and we're going to make sure that we're involved in that,
Yeah.
no matter what.
I think it's really interesting because especially coming into the, I guess you call it the oyster industry. I'm still fairly new. I've had my business about a year, but it's very much community oriented. Everybody has each other's backs. Like all different oyster farmers share different techniques and
Mhm.
innovation. It's really about protecting the waters and where, like you said, like it's where your livelihood is now. And
Mhm.
so it's like wanting to keep that clean and want to have these sustainable practices to be able to do that for years and years to come, while also helping to restore these waters as well.
And yeah, one thing I will say about the oyster industry, it is one of the best to be in. We are all competitors, but we I think we all want the same thing.
Hmm.
And that's ultimately to grow more oysters. And we go to these Oyster South symposiums, and it's a group of people just like us sharing information, scientists, schools, businesses, distributors. It's everybody, and it's creating something powerful enough to actually protect us from really the property development, the development of
Yeah.
these coastlines.
Can you elaborate on the role of oysters as natural filter feeders, which you kind of touched on, and
Yeah,
their ability to improve water quality?
absolutely. An adult oyster filters 50 gallons a day, and that is a fact that's being spouted everywhere. But what people don't know is they're also carbon traps. They sequester carbon and nitrogen out of the ecosystem. They're trying to basically figure out. They're doing studies right now to figure out exactly how much carbon is being taken out, but it is I believe it's pretty significant. We've got shoreline protection, carbon trap, filtering water. From one example I use is with when we started our farm, we put in a couple of million oysters on accident the first year, and it created a reef. And that reef brought more fish, and now we're starting to see a lot more shrimp. And the first year we farmed, we saw no sharks, and then the next year we saw one shark, and then four sharks. And now last year we saw like 14 sightings of sharks. So another way is they're using oysters to restore the New York Harbor with the Billion Oyster Project. They're doing it in the Chesapeake Bay. They're putting in I think 10 billion oysters. They're doing it down in the Gulf. It's basically a tool in our kit to start restoring some of the damage or some of the developments that we've done. So,
Yeah, I like that point because it kind of leads me into my next question, the evolution of oyster farming. So, can you share how oyster farming practices have evolved over time to prioritize sustainability?
okay, I can tell you what I know. Oysters were grown on bottom, and they were typically wild harvested. And so, in for the last 100 years, or even farther back, everything has been wild harvest. They use tongs,
Mhm.
which are just like metal rakes, and so we've got wild tonging, and then there's also dredging, which dredge comes through and just kind of takes everything. Through that evolution, we've now come into the triploid oyster, which is a tetraploid and a diploid, and they do occur naturally, so it's not a GMO. They do occur naturally in the wild. It's basically a sterile oyster that doesn't
Okay.
spawn.
I was curious because I was like, I'm not sure that I know what that is. Or,
So there's a couple of reasons they did that. The summer and the spring is when oysters are spawning. So
Mhm.
the inside gets really kind of mushy, and it's not very pleasant to eat. So also they've got rules about harvesting in the summer, and that is because they didn't want to
Mhm.
affect the spawn. So this new triploid oyster, it's sterile. So what that means is instead of the summer when it's using its energy to spawn, it's using that energy to fatten up. So these oysters not only they're growing extremely fast.
Mhm.
We can get a market oyster in a year, and it's a good sized oyster. It's the
Yeah.
what I'm gonna be farming with in 10 years. I'm hoping is something really cool. We're watching the new tech like so. It was bottom cages is typically that was done up north, up in Massachusetts. They've had a couple of decades in this, maybe more. Virginia's many decades into it with bottom cages, and that's where we actually started at, and we are in bottom cages. Just because of the scale, you can fit a lot more in them. But then it elevated to farming on the top water, which puts floats on it, and the oysters got extremely pretty. Putting them on, they're just being tumbled. So that was kind of the newer tech, the
Mhm.
floating, and now they're really trying to make that safe in hurricanes.
How long do you leave them in their cages? Like,
Yeah,
how
I can
long?
give you a
Yeah,
quick
yeah. Okay,
rundown
there we
of
go.
so for us, we find that it grows on a bell curve, and it's basically within a year we're yielding most of our crop from that year. So it's such an interesting thing about this is the farmer picks the size of the oyster they sell. So
Mhm,
some farms can get their whole crop to market in 9 months, 6 months,
mhm,
if they choose to sell a more of a petite cocktail oyster. But it's all based on the amount of food in the water. So if you go down the coast to Florida, and really North Carolina has it too, just extremely fast growth. But with the fast growth, you get all the biofouling. You get a lot of it, and it's really hard to manage. As you go up to Canada, the oysters can take 3 years, multiple seasons, uh, just because the water's so cold
mhm.
that there's not as much food in the water. When you would think that, that's a bad thing, but I was told by another oyster farmer, Murder Point, he was like, if the oysters are growing slow, you have more time to manage them.
Mhm.
Things don't get out of hand as bad. All you have to do is just plant more oysters so that you've got that gap filled. But it's really based on how much food they're getting a day and how much sunshine is hitting that water every day. And I've actually thought of just a question too. Like as a dietitian, what is the healthiest part of an oyster? Like what is the thing that you get out of an oyster that it's hard to find the nutrients of somewhere else that's hard to replace? Is it the actual just protein? It's like a gram of protein per oyster,
Yeah,
or
so oysters actually they are a good source of protein, but I
okay,
would say the most like abundant
yes.
nutrient in them that really makes them a star is their zinc content, their iron content, vitamin
Hmm.
B12,
And
copper. So they're really rich in vitamins and minerals.
I was gonna say, and that stuff is to keep you healthy.
Yeah,
Very, I know nothing about.
yeah,
So
yeah,
like,
absolutely.
okay,
Yeah, so
okay,
so as far as like vitamins and minerals, so zinc, really, I mean, it contributes to so many different functions, but it
yes.
really helps with, most people know immunity. But I believe six oysters is like 350% of your daily value of zinc. So it really
Wow.
packs a punch.
Can you have too much zinc?
It's a very nutrient dense food, and like anything,
Okay.
there you can have too much of a good thing. I tell people I wouldn't sit there and eat 48 oysters several times a week, just like with anything. But
Right.
as far as consuming and adding to your diet, comparatively, like how much that you actually need to eat and how much that you get from it. So like eating six oysters and getting that much zinc. So you're getting like 300% of the daily value of zinc. You're getting 150% of the daily value of iron. You have
Hmm.
copper, selenium in there. So
Hmm.
all of these vitamins and minerals that are crucial for health and all different sort of like pathways in your body. It provides so much in just a small amount. Does that make sense? It's like a multivitamin. When we're talking about nutrition and sustainable seafood, people they see wild caught as typically that's what you want to get. It's going to be better quality, better practices when you're getting, wild caught seafood, but not so much in the oyster realm.
It is so ingrained into the system that we want wild caught salmon, wild caught fish, and it's almost value added when people say that.
Mm-hmm.
But for oysters, it's actually kind of the opposite.
I've shucked wild oysters. I've tasted wild oysters, which again, they're not bad, but like, they aren't as
They're
polished and pristine.
but the wild oysters are usually harvested and they're sold to a processor, and
Yeah.
so the quality control is not exactly there. Like meat to shell ratio on farmed raised oysters is far superior to the meat to shell
Yeah.
ratio, just because of our tumbling and the techniques that we're using.
Yeah. So could you address, common misconceptions or myths that surround oyster consumption, such as the belief about not eating oysters in months without the letter R?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a couple of reasons that these laws slash wives' tales got passed. Originally, mechanical refrigeration was not very prevalent 100 years ago, but the laws didn't really exist to say you couldn't harvest because it was 100 years ago, so people could harvest or people could just go out there and grab it. Vibrio in the summertime, and they didn't really understand the science behind the bacteria Vibrio, and so people would
Mhm.
get sick. So the wives' tale got created like you'll get sick if you eat them in a month and hour. Oysters are one of the most regulated seafoods. Our shellfish sanitation guy actually comes and tells us that. In forms of traceability, we can trace that oyster from where it was pulled to which truck it got in, and then to the next truck And if it goes through distributors, it's all tracked. And the temp and time and temp says it's not only is it tracked, the temperature the whole time it was tracked.
Mhm.
So oysters are very, very safe to eat. There is a warning, and it's basically for people that are immunocompromised.
It is cool to see the, I keep saying the evolution, but like really being able to transport this seafood to be able to get these things. Like for me to be able to get oysters that were harvested a day or two ago and sent overnight in a landlocked state. I'm in Colorado. It's pretty cool to see that. And a lot of people, they like to hear that. There's a lot of people, transplants in Colorado, and a lot of people from the coast. And um, that I find are the most receptive when I do oyster pop-ups, and they love to hear where their oysters are coming from. And and for me to be able to say I work directly with this oyster farmer, like it's not, I'm not just like getting these from like Whole Foods and
Right.
selling them,
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
it's
Exactly.
like I know
Exactly.
exactly where it's coming from. I have the tags, and these are oysters you're
So
not going to get anywhere else.
exactly. And then just so weird, because I was on my end, if people want to support, like they want to know where their money is going. Sometimes,
Yeah,
for me,
yeah,
I always look at that. I always am like, who is this benefiting? Like where is this
yeah.
ultimately ending up?
And
Uh,
even if you don't personally oysters, because I know they can be a divisive food. Some people really don't like them, and then other people like
mhm.
myself and all the people that I work with and whatever love oysters, but you don't have to love them to acknowledge how amazing they are for the environment, to be able to understand that. You don't have to be a consumer, but to at least know that they provide so much for our environment and how sustainable they are, and moving forward, like what can happen if we start eating more oysters. Because again,
Yeah.
this is like still like a very new industry, and that's the exciting
Hmm.
part. I mean, people have been eating oysters for thousands of years, but I
Hmm.
mean, as far as like an industry itself and farming and all these different techniques that we've discussed, it's all fairly new.
Yeah, I would
But
say like breaking off, the history breaks off, and where the new timeline starts is at the spawning of the triploid. Like
yeah,
once that kind of got introduced, I mean, it's almost infinite what you could do.
oysters have what we call terroir. So that's, with wine, you would say terroir. Those are like
Absolutely.
characteristics of wine where the grapes were grown, the
Hmm.
soil. But in oyster world, it's
Hmm.
terroir. So kind of like that salinity, the minerality of the water, like where it's from.
And basically, what type of bottom the oysters are grown on. So maybe even if they're sitting on the floating top, if it's so
Mhm.
we've got muddy bottoms, we've got sandy bottoms, we've got a mixture, and the bottom adds so much to the flavor. I can tell if an oyster has been grown on sand just by the flavor. Our oysters are in a big muddy area, and
Mhm.
that's what gives it that little. If there's no mud in the oyster, which hopefully there's not, sometimes maybe, but if you taste it, it tastes very minerally, and that
Yeah.
is coming directly from the type of bottom. Also, the terroir is created from any freshwater like streams that you might have, like a freshwater creek that comes into your estuary.
There's so many
Mhm.
different things that you can do to change the oyster. And I don't think people really think about that or really even know about that. That, they're not just like pulling them out of the water. There's all different techniques that farmers are using to make it a firmer oyster, or to, um,
There are so many great initiatives going on right now in the United States. Just some of the ones that I know about. We've got in North Carolina, we do reef restoration, which I see going on right in the river that we've got going on.
mhm,
We've got the Billion Oyster Project, which is trying to save the harbor up in New York, and is successfully doing that. We've been there,
mhm.
we've gone to two of the events, and every year they basically they do like a critter count. Like, what did we find in the harbor this year? Because the harbor was dead. There was no signs of life in it. And last year, I mean, I think they had a dolphin in there. They're starting to see
Oh, wow.
dolphins come back, seahorses, eels. I mean, and that's the Billion Oyster Project. You've got the Chesapeake Bay, which decided that New York's doing a billion, so they're going to do 10 billion into the Chesapeake Bay, and they are starting to see real results with that.
Yeah.
We've got in Georgia, there's a nonprofit called the Shell to Shore program, and
Mhm.
they are encouraging, they're basically actually informing customers and restaurants about the benefits of collecting your shells, and they're collecting those shells, and they're restoring the Georgia coastline.
Oh, wow.
Down in Florida, they're also restoring the coastline. Let's see, I'm not too familiar with what's going on the West or the Gulf Coast, but in our area, every state that is touching the water is using oysters and creating some sort of initiative to put more oysters in the water or get their shells back in the water, which is just, it's amazing. I mean, there's not a lot of like everything kind of, people are like, oh, things are getting worse just in every kind of state. But with oysters, I'm like, we actually have a chance. Like, we have a chance to like rebuild the coastline, which is
Hmm.
it's a hugely valuable asset for food sources. I would encourage anybody that lives close to the water to find your local oyster farmer and get oysters from them because the best oyster is the freshest.
Yeah.
Looks and shucking, they have a thing to do with it, but pure enjoyment, just for taste, it's the freshest, and it always
Yeah,
is.
absolutely. I guess just kind of like to wrap this up, and I know we've touched on just about everything. From your perspective as a oyster farmer, like we said, it's like still like a pretty new industry. There, you have some autonomy and flexibility to kind of learn new things. Where do you see this industry going from here?
So, where I see this industry going is I see, like I was saying, we're farming in the Stone Age out here. We're manually lifting these cages. We're like, or using a very slow crane, or we're out there flipping them. So I see technology coming in, and I see this industry scaling. I see a lot of support from the government to scale this industry.
Mhm.
I see a lot of support from the colleges, grants, the SOAR program through the Pew Grant. I mean, that's another initiative that's going on right now, and it's the Pew Grant is funding ideas for farmers. So with all the support of Pew Foundation and everybody, I do see this industry becoming hopefully on par with every other protein, and if not surpassing them, just because of the benefits of it. I see a very bright future for oyster farming. It's very resilient. I mean, everybody's really passionate about what they do, so you can take heavy losses with a hurricane or something, and there's like a giant community around you. So I think that's sending us up in an upward trajectory, no
Mhm.
doubt. I see a lot of
Yeah.
happy people making a good living, and I see the inland becoming more educated on it and really having access. I see smaller cities that have been landlocked getting better access to
Hmm.
oysters, and a lot of the oyster companies over time they become seafood distributors. So I think people are going to start eating more food out of the ocean.
Yeah. If
I
making
think
it more accessible.
yeah, I see a more accessible future for shellfish or for
Yeah.
all fish, but a lot of shellfish. This is yeah, this it's like the one thing you can look at and be like, that's
Yeah.
getting better. You
Yeah,
know,
and I think this is kind of just the beginning, and like when you're looking at the whole picture, it's been
right.
around for a bit, but it's like we're still evolving and learning more.
It's like how long have they been farm raising chickens?
Yeah,
Like what that hundreds of years maybe?
on this scale, it's like pretty
Right.
recent, like at least the scale we see
Exactly.
today.
Exactly. So we can actually study what they did to scale and just copy
Yeah,
it and put it into water. We'll
yeah,
see.
and then also and then the more oysters, you're restoring more of our waters as well, so it's a win-win. You're
That
getting
dude,
you have this
that's
food that just like gives back to the environment, and it gives back to you via
and
health.
I was gonna say, yeah, and our customers, we can sleep good at night knowing that we're making our customers healthier.
Well, thank you so much, Kyle. I really appreciate you coming on here and chatting about oysters, sustainability. Do you want to give us any resources, or where can we find you?
So we are crystalcoastoysters.co. We're on Instagram, and we're actually just started a YouTube channel this year. So we're putting out a
Mhm.
video every week, and it's a pretty in-depth. If you want to see us try and grow some oysters, it's a good place to watch.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Well,
just
thank you so
YouTube
much.
Crystal Coast Oysters. That's the best way to find
Crystal
us.
Coast Oysters. Yeah, they have a great social media presence. You have a great Instagram. And yeah, no, I'm excited to check out your YouTube. I know there's going to be a lot of good educational tidbits, especially for anybody that's interested after this to see to learn more about oysters, because honestly they're fascinating. So thank you so much for
Absolutely.
joining us. Yeah, and I will talk to you soon. I'm
Absolutely.